Okay. Well, I'm really thrilled to introduce as our guest speaker Alice Walker, who's a PhD student in the School of the Built Environment at Oxford Brookes University. She's going to talk about her PhD research in later life housing decisions and her experiences navigating her professional and academic life. She's had a very interesting background. She started her career as a carer in both domiciliary and residential settings, and she later went on to work in acquired brain injury and homelessness. She established a specialised advice centre for older adults with complex housing and care needs, and she currently works as a civil servant in environmental policy. And I'd also like to say that Alice is an all-round good egg, because she has the formal role at Oxford Brookes of being my buddy in the PhD buddy scheme that she set up at Oxford Brookes. And she's the main reason that I've managed to keep my sanity and remain reasonably cheerful during my PhD. Over to you, Alice.
Well, thank you very much. I paid Wendy £55 to say that, so that's money well spent already. Thanks, Wendy. Okay, we've practiced this, so we should now seamlessly screen share or not, as the case may be. Let's find out what happens. Has that worked? It's almost seamless, isn't it? Okay, well, I'm going to make a start. If anyone does want to interrupt me at any point, please do so. Please set your bar quite low now, I would say. Yeah. So as Wendy said, my name is Alice Walker, and I'm a PhD student at Oxford Brookes in built environment. So I'm working on a studentship looking at health, housing and social care in an ageing population. And my particular area of interest is in later life housing decision making. So what happens when people thinking about how and where and when they live in later life, how they navigate and construct their housing pathways, how they think about futures and identities, how they interact with others and other things, and how this might all shape the way that people do or don't make decisions. So who am I? I mean, Wendy's already told you, so that's spoiled surprise there. This is me with my grandma. We were just talking about that. In my mind, my grandma was a very elderly lady, and I've now had the realization that in this picture, she's about 5 years older than me. But she is dressed as Margaret Thatcher, which I don't tend to do in working hours. So this is me then, and this is me now. So as Wendy said, I spent most of my working life in health, housing and social care. So my first job actually was working in a long stay geriatric hospital in Cowdenbeath when I was 18, which was confusing because I thought that Cowdenbeath was in Wales. Turns out it's not, it's in Scotland. So that was challenging. I then worked in sort of dementia care, nursing homes, brain injury, all kinds of different places and things, before ending up setting up and running a housing advice service under First Stop, as was, and then carrying that on under the auspices of the local authority. And then I kind of abandoned older people really to specialise in international timber, which is, if you think aging's fascinating, international timber is just next level, really. I'm also the daughter and daughter-in-laws of people in later life. And actually, during the course of this research, my in-laws were grappling real time with later life housing decision-making. Would they stay put? Would they move? And so I kind of offered them the benefit of my expert wisdom. And they told me to go and get stuffed. So that worked out really well. So this is going to be a very highly informal jog through later life housing. It's going to be telling you why I think it matters, looking briefly at my kind of research, and then reflecting on some of the challenges and benefits that I've found moving from professional practice to academic practice and then kind of back again. So I think one of the to get started, one of the most frustrating things that I've found in both kind of academic and professional practice around housing is the lack of clarity around what we're talking about in terms of what is later life housing, what is it not, when does it start, when does it finish. So to start off, I'm going to say what I mean by it. So I talk about people in later life, by which I mean people over 65 living in their own homes. So not in nursing, residential or care homes, not for any kind of reason of, discriminatory practice, just that I have to focus on one area. And again, 65, I realise, is not unproblematic, but it's pragmatic. So I use the term later life housing to refer to any form of housing that has an age or care criteria attached to it, and general needs to mean any housing that does not. And then if we kind of turn to look at the later life housing category, of which we have a little snapshot here, we're confronted by the almost fantastic range of terms used. So sheltered, warden controlled, SHEC, extra care, retirement. It's just insane, really. And it means that a lot of the time people are talking at cross purposes. And I've had conversations where I've been talking to a social worker, having an enormous argument about which kind of housing model is better. And it turned out half an hour later, we were talking about the same thing. We were just calling it something different. The age criteria for later life housing is also quite random. So the Peabody Trust offers housing options for older people at 50, Abbeyfield 55, Anchor, which is one of the largest providers in England, is 55. McCarthy Stone, which people generally have heard of, is 60 for retirement living and 70 for retirement plus, I believe. Local authorities can set their own criteria, and they generally include bungalows within their definition of later life housing. So City of York Council, where I live, is 60. Manchester City Council, for example, is generally 55. I did actually speak to one of the kind of super high-end retirement villagers and asked them what their criteria was. And they told me, we have residents who are 55, 60 or 65. And I was like, aha, but what happens to residents when they are 56 or 62? Do you kick them out? And they didn't think that was funny, and they couldn't answer me either. So ARCO, the Association of Retirement Community Operators, have been lobbying for a while now to look at kind of standardising some of the language, and actually they propose integrated retirement community. And while I kind of like aspects of their model, I think that the word retirement can be problematic. I think, I looked at the recent stats for when I might retire, and I think at the moment it's like 99 or something. I'm never going to retire. So I'm never going to be able to go to a retirement community. So I prefer to use the term age exclusive and integrated age exclusive. So I think retirement can be, if you haven't worked or if you haven't retired, where do you fit into that? So here we see kind of my breakdown. So age exclusive, generally, what used to be called sheltered or warden controlled, integrated age exclusive, so extra care, SHEC, close care, that kind of thing. So we've got a number of shared characteristics and some disparate ones, generally around on-site care provision and meal provision. So that's the words that I use. Again, there's no kind of benefit to them really, but they're the ones that I like. As I said, bungalows sit in a strange middle land. So if you are in social housing, bungalows fall under later life housing and have an age and care criteria. If you are in the private rented or owner occupation market, anyone can buy them, and they generally buy them and turn them into dormer bungalows, thus rendering them less useful for people in later life. So there we are. That's kind of what I like to talk about. So turning briefly to my fascinating research. So my research involves speaking to 54 people in York using semi-structured interviews. So York is a city in northern England where I live. It's currently also home to the world's most irritating Christmas market. So if you're thinking of coming to York, don't at the moment, unless you want to pay, I think it's £10 for a tiny apple crumble It's really, yeah, it's not fun at the moment. So I interviewed 38 people in later life, aged between 65 and 99, 29 women, 9 men. 4 actually were couples that I interviewed together. And that was really interesting, watching them not bicker, but bicker a lot of the time as they kind of played out housing decisions in real time. And it was really quite interesting. I also spoke to 15 practitioners who worked for the local authority. The majority were in housing, with 2 in adult social care. I did try and speak to practitioners in the third sector, but they were just too busy to speak to me, which is fair enough, really. So interviews were recorded and transcribed, and then I used reflexive thematic analysis to construct magical meaning. So like every other presentation I'm sure you guys have ever had, I'm going to start by pointing out that we are a globally aging population. And I'm sure that's hardly a revelation. But I think what's interesting as well is the way that we live in later life is changing. For example, the number of people aged over 50 who have never married has doubled in the last 10 years. And I think a lot of that's to do with like online gaming, really. People are just too busy. I'm going to say men are too busy playing computer games. Most people over 50 in England are and remain owner-occupiers, but as we can see, there's been like a massive increase in the number of people in later life in private rented accommodation. That's doubled over the last 20 years. But broadly speaking, most people in later life in England live in mainstream general needs housing. So they're not living in later life housing, and they're not living in care-based accommodation. Most people, if you ask them, broadly want to stay put, to live in the place they currently do until they die, ideally peacefully in their bed, which is, you know, an admirable hope. And again, this is not in any way revelationary. One of the paradoxes of later life is it can be a time of great change in terms of bodies, abilities, identities, finance, time, status. And in my mum's case, clothes. My mum has recently told me that in later life, she intends to only wear Lucy and Yak fleece dungarees. And initially I was like, okay, that's great, mum, that's fine. You know, you do whatever you do, until I realized how much money these fleece dungarees cost. And it's like, I'm not like, I was thinking, do I need to ring some kind of like fraud hotline to dob my mum in? But I'm going to leave it a little while. So it's time. Yeah, Lisa, they're 90. My mum has 3 pairs and she's on pension credit. Not judging, but so yeah, so leaving aside my mum's very expensive clothing habits, there's great change, but I think there's also great continuity, or there's an unexpected lack of change, or change is slow until it's fast. And the same is true, I think, of the decisions people make in relation to how and where and when they live. Many of the housing decisions in early and midlife are shaped by education, training, employment, family stuff, by the opportunities or challenges faced by households, so singular, joint, couples, family, as they kind of navigate their housing pathway, taking turnings, negotiating junctions or dead ends with the occasional breakdown along the way. If nothing happens, people tend to just carry on driving until something does happen. But the later life housing pathway is both a continuation and a change. I think it's a bit like, you know, when you're driving along and the sat nav suddenly changes from day to night. And it's the same road, but it looks and feels a bit different. And I often think this is part of the motorway that you might legitimately want to avoid, where like various lanes merge and cross over. There's numerous potential exits, as we've just seen. Most of them are really badly signposted. You know, you hit the motorway at 65 and you have to get used to, you know, new driving conditions, possibly with poor visibility. And this is why, you know, I think that later life housing decisions are really fascinating, but also potentially super important, because they're different from housing decisions at other life stages. I think firstly, because of the changes that later life can herald can magnify the already significant impact that housing can have on health and well-being. As the Marmot 10-year plus review puts it, housing is key in facilitating positive health and well-being outcomes, especially for older people who may be more likely to experience a range of health and mobility issues. Or actually, I think what's more important is that they might predict or expect or deny or worry about having health and mobility issues now or in the future. Secondly, it's different because the options are different. As we've just seen, there are a number of housing types that you have to be a certain age to access. So the decision to be made contains different factors. And that's is not to say that, of course, that access to these options is unconstrained or necessarily equitable. But it means that, if you wait up on, the eve of your 55th birthday and you sit there until midnight and the clocks strike, your pathway will contain junctions that you potentially didn't have an hour before. And thirdly, and I think most importantly, later life housing decisions are different because they have different meanings and weights attached to them, different associations and connotations that may impact identities in different ways and constitute sites of threat and fear and avoidance at times. To engage with later life housing is to engage with later life. It's to take the slip road onto that part of the motorway. And once you're on it, you can't really do a U-turn. And even if you do a U-turn, people have still seen you driving on the later life housing pathway, probably in a Skoda Fabia. So it's no wonder that some people might prefer to stay on the A road for as long as possible, even if it risks missing the junction, because where and how we live as we grow older is not something that many of us think about until we find ourselves in difficulties and wishing that we'd planned ahead. So for me, one of the key questions is, why do we choose to do nothing about something that we know is likely? And I think there's kind of two schools of thought here for me. The first I call the case of the indestructible ant. And this is where, the bad future won't happen to me because I had a great aunt who smoked 1,000 Benson and Hedges a day, and she was like laying in a bath of asbestos, licking battery acid. And she lived to be 112, and she was killed by a bus hitting her while she was abseiling. So the existence of such an individual cancels out all of the other less impressive specimens and becomes the proxy proof of the future that we'd like and therefore imagine that we will have. I have to say that in reality, this isn't actually a picture of my aunt because my aunt is 22 years old. Because my uncle married very late in life and very young lady. So it wouldn't be appropriate. So we have the indestructible ant on one hand, and then on the other hand, we have what I call the case of the creeping rash. So here we become aware of like a slight irritation, and maybe it wasn't there yesterday, it might have got worse tomorrow, and we could go and get it looked at to find out what it is, but we won't because it's probably nothing. And if you go, you might ask some questions and find out some information that you don't want to hear. And then days and weeks and months go by and the rash spreads, and finally your arm falls off whilst you're abseiling, but by then it's too late to get a GP's appointment. So the sensible position would seem to be somewhere between the two, between the ant and the arm, that we'd use the experiences of others, both good and bad, to construct versions of ourselves and our futures that are credible, tolerable, desirable, that we're able to honestly and realistically evaluate our current and future selves and take action if we need to try and increase the likelihood of living to 112 and reduce the chances of our arm falling off. That we access and use the information that we need to know, is it an irritation caused by a new fabric softener, or is it the bite of a banana spider? So I think when people are thinking about housing decisions, they're engaged in future work and identity work. They're projecting bodies into buildings, real and imagined, current and possible. They're constructing previews. They're effectively forecasting. They're trying to avoid behaving in personally objectionable ways. badness, regret, loss, and to maximize agency, identity congruence, and goodness. As Wilson and Gilbert argue, what people really want to know about the future is what the level of happiness and well-being will be, and which junction on the pathway is most likely to take them there. So the problem with the future is, like the bear said, it's always over the other side of the mountain, and there might be storm clouds on the horizon. The defining feature of the future is that it is not now. It might be 10 minutes away, but we all know from procrastination and avoidance that 10 minutes is more than long enough to put something off. There's always plenty of time. And this is seen in time. Wait a second. I need to shout at my dog. Stop it. Where are we? Yeah, so the future is always over the other side of the mountain. So this is seen time and time and time again in the narratives of people in later life. So I spoke to one chap and he told me that he was really quite worried about the future, but he didn't plan on doing anything about it until he turned 75 and he ran his last marathon. After that, he's going to be rickety and he might move into a bungalow. Was he a regular runner? I asked. No, but he felt he might be. Or the couple who both had health conditions and lived in a house that was too big for them. And they worried quite considerably about what would happen if one of them fell ill or developed mobility issues, but they planned to wait until something happened before making changes. And we talked about, what those changes might be. And they said, well, typically people put in a stair lift, don't they? And that was it. That was as far as their thoughts went. The fundamental problem is that for many people, thinking about future later life can be unpleasant or worrying or both. And it can be associated with thoughts of decline and ill health, a reduction in status, stigmatized identities. To plan for how and where and when you'll live in later life is to make eye contact with your future self. And that might be an image that's not congruent with your current identity, which is too linked to that which you wish to avoid: frailty, decline, care needs, the institution. To make changes to the home, even ones that may be helpful, is to inscribe readable signs of potentially unwanted identities onto the building and onto the bodies inside that building. As such, building talk might be more acceptable than body talk, meaning that adaptations are aligned with home improvements and divorced from bodily function. A downstairs bathroom is a home improvement, and people are more than happy to talk openly about it. A raised toilet seat inside that bathroom is something quite different. A really interesting example of this temporal tussle is Jude. So Jude is 71 and she's been living in her family home for the last 20 years. She's from an armed forces family, and until this last move, her housing pathway has been shaped by frequent relocations. She sees herself as somebody who's pragmatic, adaptable, who just gets on with things. She feels that time is starting to catch up with her, despite her efforts to use physical fitness to fight against what life's going to do to me. Her intention is to stay put, but it's clear that she hasn't actually discussed this plan with her children or her husband. The plan or to make changes now is too threatening. She knows what she wants to avoid, going into a care home, and they've vaguely talked about putting in a wet room. But she says, you sort of don't want to have to make decisions thinking that you're going to get old and decrepit. It's probably a bit of a vanity thing, I think. Really, it makes me resistant a little bit to planning too much. Instead, she pushes the future off to the other side of the mountain. And this future self will come into being when she reaches the age of 80, which is the age of her sister Amy, although Amy can pass for 50 because of good genes. So it's then the job of the future self to prompt itself to think about the future. So she said, so I'm thinking maybe when I get to Amy's age, that's when I'll start to think, think about your future, maybe. Although it'd be really interesting to know actually if Amy at 90 can pass for 60, does she then become a form of indestructible aunt? And that means that Jude can delay her unwanted future even further. While giving future selves the cold shoulder can push off thinking about housing until what feels like a safer but also potentially dangerous distance, for others, decisions are shaped by changing the parameters of threatening interactions. So Jude's talking about why she wouldn't consider a move to later life housing. She said, then I'm admitting that I'm getting older, you see. It's pride is a big thing. Vanity is a big thing. And this actually speaks to something that puzzled me for a really long time. Half of all the people I spoke in later life that I spoke to lived in later life housing, and most of them lived in age exclusive. And for a long time, I couldn't put my finger on what was strange about a lot of the stories I was hearing about relocation to age exclusive AE. Then I realised they weren't stories about relocation to AE. They were stories about relocating that happened to be being told to me by someone who was sitting in their flat in AE. And this can be seen in Charlotte's story. So after the death of her son, Charlotte decided to sell her, it was a really large house actually, it's like a 7-bedroom, I think, and move. So when thinking about the criteria she used to facilitate the relocation, she was really clear that her primary drive was to be near her family. That initially she had no thoughts of moving to age exclusive. It wasn't on her radar. It wasn't for her. And she said, I mean, I've seen these things advertised on telly, McCarthy Stone, but I didn't really know what they were. Her accommodation search is carried out using sites like Rightmove and Zoopla. She initially viewed a range of general needs flats and bungalows, but found them unsatisfactory and expensive. So then she happened to see a flat in a private AE development. And she felt the service charge was really high, and she didn't like leasehold, but it was offset by the lower purchase price. For her, the attraction of the development was the location and the flat. She didn't factor into her decision any of the AE characteristics, and actually they were a negative for her. She said about the warden, it wasn't a thing like, I'll come here because there is one. That's what was there. I'd have to accept it. Her daughter-in-law actually tried to put her off. She said she worried that she was too young for AE. She said not necessarily too young in years, but it might make her get old quickly. And these ideas are to be found in the majority of the stories of people moving to AE. They weren't moving there for the features that are distinct to the housing model. Age exclusivity, nobody mentioned anything to do with the age of people living there. Telecare, generally people were not keen on that. A scheme manager, people were very, I felt very sorry for scheme managers. They were not moving to move to AE. They were moving and they chose an AE flat, but they could also have chosen something in general needs. They weren't moving to age in place, and nobody ever used the term age in place. They were moving and then decided to stay put because they liked it. So for many people, AE has elements of stigma through misconceptions, through negative associations, through its perceived proximity to the institution, through the basic fact that it is not general needs. 1 in 3 people in the UK believe that retirement living is the same as an old people's home. And this really matters when people are trying to square their identity with a move that will take them off the A road. Really, basically, I mean, to enter AE, as we've seen, you have to be over 50 or 55 or 60. By entering AE, you're therefore outing yourself as 50 or 55 or 60, and you're aligning yourself with internal and external judgments about what that might mean. To pretend that for some people this doesn't matter is to pretend that ageism doesn't exist, that older identities are not sometimes tainted or spoiled identities, that AE is not a step on the road away from general needs and towards, notionally, the institution. To try and manage this threat, people use what I've called a passing place. So they're recasting AE as general needs or general needs adjacent by emphasizing the general and minimizing the specific. And I think this explains why so often I sat in an AE flat listening to people tell me why they didn't choose to move to AE. So alongside shifting constructions to make them more congruent and less threatening, people also use others. often peers or friends, to map options, to build bridges of tolerability, as a reference point, as a cautionary tale. And this is really pronounced in those who've relocated to AE, with half of them having a connection to somebody who lived or had lived in the development they moved to. So proxy experience can enable people to get a foot in the door, quite literally. These, we know that AE schemes can be quite difficult to penetrate from the outside, and can help people to realistically imagine and construct and forecast. And if we can imagine something, we can see ourselves in it. This is really interesting, and we see an example of Hazel. So Hazel lived in she lived in a neighbourhood almost her whole life. But she felt that the neighbourhood was changing through an influx of students, and her husband was living with Parkinson's and had been falling hundreds of times a day. So they decided to move. Like many of the relocators, her initial search was general needs focused, but they couldn't find quite what they needed. She didn't consider AE because she didn't know such places existed. So when I said, well, actually, how did you end up in AE then? She was like, oh, actually, maybe I saw an advert in an estate agent's window. No, I actually had some friends in here. And she'd forgotten about this insider information. So Hazel jokingly said that she'd been telling people that she was moving to an old people's home. But it's also clear that her insider friend provides a reassurance to her concerns about her identity. And she said, it was very comforting to know that Adam was here because I knew that he wasn't disabled or mentally incapable. Others can facilitate access to spaces, to increase option awareness, to tell the truth about later life. So the more stories and experiences people have access to, the more that myths and misconceptions can be challenged or at very least discussed. One of the things about the data that really broke my heart as a former housing advisor was that pretty much nobody accessed any kind of formal advice and information in relation to any housing decision through choice. People could see the value of advice and information, but it was generally expressed in terms of it would be helpful for other people. They didn't see themselves as needing it. And again, I think this is about a way of recasting, of passing a later life to housing decision as a general one. We know that I think that 98% of general housing decisions are made without advice and information. So to access advice and information is to shift the decision from the mainstream to the special, from the safe to the suspect. So if formal advice and information in its current format is potentially intolerable to a lot of people, informal advice and information from friends or peers might be the only form that some people access. So what can be done to try and improve housing decision making? I think it's easier perhaps to start with what we need not to do. The answer is not for power to speak truth to people. It is not for national or local government to tell people to think more. The barrier to decision making isn't that people are unaware of the future, it's the opposite. Simply reminding people of what may lay around the corner on the other side of the mountain and expecting that to somehow catalyse them into action doesn't work, and may actually have the opposite effect of causing people increased stress, distress, and action paralysis. What needs to change is how the future is conceptualized and the stories that are told about it. So information alone is not enough. Instead, we need to create the conditions for decision making, starting with confronting our own fears of aging, others, the fourth age, the institution. De Beauvoir calls on us to stop cheating, to stop pretending that we aren't our own future aged selves, and that we don't see our futures reflected in the aging bodies of others. I was going to do this in a French accent, but now I've got self-doubt and I might not.
Alice, sorry, can I just interrupt and just say we might need to just speed up the last few slides because we just want to make sure there's some time for questions at the end. So maybe you could whiz through those.
Okay,
I think because it's 22 now. So yeah, I think if you
haven't we got until past?
Okay, no, that's fine. Yeah, okay, yeah. No, carry on. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. I mean, I can do, but
no, it's fine. You've got till 5:30. That's fine. Lisa's just confirmed it. I thought it was 5:15, but that's fine. That's fine. Carry on. Sorry.
No worries. Okay. No, that's fine. Okay, so yes, so when we look at the, I'm not going to do the French accent now. I've now got extreme self-doubt. So when we look at the future image of our own future provided by the old, we don't believe it. An absurd inner voice whispers that that will never happen to us. That when that happens, it will no longer be ourselves, it happens to. But of course, it will. So what will help us make decisions that are possibly likely to lead to the greatest happiness and well-being? So confronting and challenging the stigma of aging and our fears of the fourth age, and interrogating the role that this may have on identity and decision making. Improving access to a wide range of proxy experiences, including institutional care. Increased insight into future work and how our skills might be improved and errors reduced. How we think about the future, we can work on that. Encouraging debate and discussion and dialogue at all stages, and including the most dread topics, those that we really don't want to think about. And increasing access to advice and information in tolerable and useful forms. So if the road to hell is paved with good intentions, then the later life housing pathway is paved with good and bad and no choices. We might be able to increase the former to improve our levels of happiness and well-being, or at least reduce our levels of fear and regret by facing the future together, by acknowledging and utilising our common ground, by embracing future selves, our own and others. We can't stop time or change or ageing, but we can, but how we think and respond to it is within our control. You can't stop the rain, but you can take an umbrella. And as such, I think about Dorothy, who was, reflecting on 99 years of life lived well and the inescapability of aging. And she told me, yesterday's newborn baby, it's a day old now, and it's older than another newborn baby. So it's a condition in which you accept life. I'd like to say that's where I'm going to stop, but I'm not, because to quote Taylor Swift, so tell me everything isn't about me. But what if it is? And it is. So one of the interesting things for me has been carrying out this work has been to consider my identities within it, as I've shifted from being a housing practitioner, a carer, a PhD student, and how I've chosen to deploy those. And this was brought home to me when I was talking about my work at a community hub with a view to recruit participants. And a woman came up to me and she said, "What makes you think you know anything about old people? How many arses have you wiped?" And to be honest, like the serious moment as I reflected on what that meant in terms of my positionality was spoilt by a bloke in the back shouting, "You can wipe mine if you need the practice." But it was necessarily a really good point. So I know from personal experience that within housing, academic qualifications can be viewed with suspicion. When I completed my master's in housing policy, I was told in no uncertain terms, do not get too big for your boots. No one wants to hear you spouting off. In my interviews with practitioners, one of the key themes was the lack of formal housing training. And this is often viewed as a positive by housing practitioners who see their skills as being learnt on the job, innate, aligned with their personality, such as honesty and empathy. At the same time, the lack of formal qualifications can be a site of conflict with other professions, such as social workers. And one housing practitioner told me, you can almost, read their minds saying, "How very dare you try and even be like a social worker?" But I was also very aware that my ability to gain access to practitioners was almost entirely because of my insider status. A lot of them said, they didn't have, due to time and resource pressures, if it hadn't been me, if I hadn't been one of them, they wouldn't have agreed to speak to me. To overplay the PhD researcher there would have been counterproductive, but I wasn't a practitioner. I was talking to people in later life with my Brookes lanyard on, but I wasn't there as a former housing advisor or to give them advice and information. But at the same time, I had knowledges that I couldn't pretend not to. And my underlying knowledge kind of bled through into my language, into my questions and my responses, inadvertently flagging deficits to them and offering options. And sort of going back to Hazel, in my framing of questions about other options that she might have explored, I was displaying my own expert knowledge, my positionality, while at the same time giving her knowledge that she didn't have before. So she said, you used a word, what's an anchor? I said, oh, anchor housing. All these names, these are new names to me. She didn't know that she didn't know about anchor or integrated age exclusive or Abbeyfield, but then she did know because I just told her. She didn't consider moving to them because she didn't know about them. And ultimately, her move to age exclusive didn't work out as she'd hoped because her husband's care needs couldn't be met there and he moved into a care home. For Hazel, it is all after the fact. She's made a housing decision and is content with it, but it was a real sight of discomfort for me. Oddly enough, I'm now working with the local authority on implementing some of the recommendations from the research. And I'm visiting AE developments that I was last in as a practitioner. And I'm explaining who I am and who I was. And I'm still not sure which is which. Here, actually, you can see me in my practitioner days. And you can also see the great love that people in later life had to me there. When I'm thinking about who I am and worrying if any of my identities are impressive, I recall an interview with Charlie. So I was going through the interview paperwork with him, and he stopped me and he said, "God, it must be really hard for you all this studying." And I began on some kind of like humble brag about, "Oh, actually, no, it's an honor and a privilege." And he said, no, I didn't mean that. I mean that most of your sort, you get into it because you've got no friends and family, and your families don't like you. And I'd like to think that I've negotiated my identities and interactions honestly and transparently, but I probably haven't. When confronted with challenges to my identities as a carer, as a practitioner, as a PhD student, I have reacted to try and protect them. And yes, I did try and put a number on how many arses I've wiped. And it was a lot. And I'm really proud of that. So yeah, that is a nice way to end it, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alice. That was really brilliant. Thanks very much. And sorry about jumping in there and thinking we had less time than we've actually got. That was pretty bad. That was great.